The Hebrews and the Jews. I am Dr. Arpaia, the author of this podcast on the history of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. Let's begin with my 4 expectations. First, I want you to recall our scientific definition of anti-Semitism that we covered in the first podcast. Second, I expect you to recognize basic terms like C, BC, BCE, CE, and AD. By the way, you may hear my cat in the background who gets jealous when I talk to my students. Third, I want you to know the relationship between the Hebrews, the Israelites, and the Jews and their physical environment. And fourth, I expect you to understand the connection between the Hebrews and 3 Abrahamic traditions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The term Abrahamic is a key term used to refer to any religion that traces its origins in one form or another to the myth of Abraham, a myth we will consider later in this podcast. Please note the word Abrahamic and the names of all religions are proper nouns, and thus always capitalized in English. Let's begin by reviewing our working definition of anti-Semitism. We have devised a scientific definition. By scientific, we mean that we have a verifiable definition. Anyone using the same criteria that we have adopted to define the term will conclude that a case in point is either anti-Semitic or not. In the previous podcast, I explained that our working definition has 4 core elements. All 4 must be present in a case study for us to conclude that we have found an example of anti-Semitism. If 1, 2, or 3 elements are present, the example falls short of anti-Semitism. If no core elements are present, the example is completely different, even if we find examples of hatred or violence towards Jews. The first core element of anti-Semitism is a Weltanschauung, or worldview, in which the Jews, all Jews, and Jewishness are thought to play an essential role in human events. Our model considers the term Jew and Jewishness to be changeful over time, according to the historical figures who invoke the 2 terms. The second core element is something Phyllis Goldstein identifies in her study, A Convenient History, the history of anti-Semitism. She argues that anti-Semitism employs stereotypes about Jews that juxtapose Jews and non-Jews as intrinsically different. The third core element follows from the second element. It is a specific way of thinking about Jews that negates their individuality. Stereotypes are, of course, one such way, but, as we shall see, there are others. At its most extreme, anti-Semitism denies the humanity of Jews. The final core element is a reliance on mythopoeia to define Jews and Jewishness. If you do not remember or understand these core elements, go back to the previous podcast and review them. Let me repeat that History 198 is not a religious studies course, nor am I an expert on Judaism. Indeed, you may know more about the religion than I do, especially if you practice it. After taking this course, many students become interested in both history and religious studies. And I encourage you to take the several courses the history department offers that satisfy the requirements in liberal studies electives. These courses are structured for both history majors and students majoring in other disciplines. Taking them will help you do better in your major classes and will prepare you for life after graduation. The history department also offers courses in many area studies, including women's studies, environmental studies, Asian studies, and LGBTQA+ studies. For students interested in double majoring, a history major dovetails nicely with many majors. Alternately, you may want to add a history minor to complete your major. History 198 satisfies one of the 5 history courses that make up the history minor. A history major will also prepare you for a successful career, by sharpening your analytical, critical thinking, and communicative skills. It may surprise you to know that among the Fortune 500 companies, that is, the most profitable companies in the USA, more CEOs majored in history and English than any other disciplines, including traditional majors in business. IUP history majors go on to rewarding careers in many walks of life, including business. Only a very few earn a PhD and become a professional historian like me. If you're interested in learning more about the courses we offer in history, or if you're toying with the idea of declaring a major or a minor, please come see me. I also invite you to come to the History Department's weekly happy hours. Faculty and students mix in the department's office in room 304 of the Humanities and Social Science building during happy hour. My colleagues and I offer students delicious, but perhaps not so nutritious, goodies, as well as coffee and soda pop free of charge. You do not have to be a history major to attend. Everyone is invited. You also might think about joining the History Club, a recognized student club on campus. The club attracts students interested in exploring history on their own, no matter what their history may be. The club goes on trips to historical sites, invites speakers to campus, and shows and discusses films and TV programs. If you're interested in history but are limited in the number of courses outside of your major, why not join the History Club? I also encourage you to explore courses in religious studies. You're required to take a basic liberal studies course in either religious studies or philosophy. So, think about signing up for Religious Studies 100, an Introduction to Religion, or Religious Studies 110, World Religions. The Religious Studies Department also offers liberal studies electives. Interested in history or religious studies? Check out the course offerings online during pre-registration or stop by the departmental offices in the Humanities and Social Science building. The History Department is on the 3rd floor, the Religious Studies Department the 5th. History 198 will provide a good foundation for further study, whether you choose a major in the History or Religious Studies departments or in any other major for that matter. Now, let's turn to my second expectation, to recognize basic terms like C, BC, BCE, CE, and AD. Take a look at this sentence. The terms C and BCE in gold font are ones that you may already know. If not, you need to learn what they mean and how to use them. C is a Latin abbreviation that means around and is used only with dates. We read around when we see C written. We do not read C. BCE stands for Before the Common Era. When we see the letters, we simply read them as BCE, rather than replacing them with the words for which the letters stand. For centuries, scholars in the Christian world used BC, before the birth of Christ, and AD, an abbreviation in Latin meaning Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord Jesus Christ. For quite some time now, scholars do not use the Christian terms BC and AD. For one, Christian scholars got the year of Jesus' birth wrong. He was born around the year 4 BC in our calendar. More importantly, the terms BCE and CE, before the Common Era and the Common Era, avoid the bias of measuring the passage of time based on one religion and not another. I will use BCE and CE in this class because Goldstein uses it in her book, A Convenient History, and because it is an acceptable way of measuring time. Nevertheless, if you prefer to use BC and AD, go right ahead. The Hebrews are central to our history of antisemitism. The Hebrews emerged as a group of tribes around 2000 BCE. The tribes called themselves Hebrews, a name derived from a word that is equivalent to migrants or immigrants in modern English. The Hebrews lived a nomadic or wandering way of life in an area of the world that we call today the Middle East. It's where the continents of Asia and Africa meet, just south of the region where Asia and Europe also meet. The Middle East is located in the easternmost part of a geographical area called the Mediterranean Basin. This region of the world includes the Mediterranean Sea and the land contiguous to it. It is considered a geographical unit because it has a unique environment from the rest of the planet. The Mediterranean Basin contains approximately 2 million square miles of land in Europe, Africa, and Asia. Altogether, this region is about the size of the continental United States. At close to 1 million square miles, the Mediterranean Sea alone constitutes approximately half of the territory. It is here that ancient Hebrew, Jewish, Egyptian, Hellenistic, and Roman civilizations developed. The Mediterranean Basin is divided into two parts along a north-south axis. Although varied, both areas have similar environments. This fact is important because historians know that an environment shapes societies. In the ancient world, the Mediterranean climate was warm and moist most of the year, thus making the basin conducive for agricultural societies. In other words, collectivities of humans, called societies, figured out how to domesticate plants and animals, get food from them, and store enough food to last through the periods when food was not readily available. Without the domestication of animals and the discovery of agriculture, ancient societies in the Mediterranean would not have been able to create civilizations. The term civilization means the material production and the cultural creations of a given group of humans in a given area of the world. In ancient times, societies developing around the Mediterranean Sea lacked the technology and know-how to sail across it. Elementary shipbuilding, difficulties in predicting storms, and, most importantly, the inability to create accurate star maps to travel at night forced sailors to remain within sight of the shoreline. Sea travel was dangerous, expensive, and time-consuming. Captains lost their way, ships sank in storms, and pirates were a constant danger. Only wealthy societies could afford to build safe harbors far from home and to create navies large enough to protect merchants, sailors, and soldiers on long-distance travel around the Mediterranean Sea. Until nautical and mathematical knowledge improved in the 5th century BCE, most Mediterranean societies lived in relative isolation, one from the other. The sea and air currents that circulated in the Mediterranean allowed for an exchange of organic and inorganic material throughout the basin. This important exchange, together with a relatively similar climate, explains why we find striking similarities among the many ancient societies far-flung in the Mediterranean. The physical geography of the Mediterranean basin also created and maintained a difference between the Mediterranean's warm and relatively moist climate and the climates of other areas in Europe, Asia, and Africa along its borders. Water, soil, plants, animals, bacteria, and even viruses, as well as inorganic material like rocks and minerals, found farther north in Europe, farther east in Asia, and farther south in Africa, rarely found their way to the Mediterranean unless brought there, intentionally or not, by humans. Vast mountain chains along the northern part of the basin limited human contact with civilizations that developed simultaneously farther north in Europe. Additional mountain ranges to the east limited human contact with other civilizations that developed simultaneously in Asia. Of course, humans eventually figured out how to cross these mountain barriers, and as humans traveled across them, they brought along organic and inorganic material. These new plants, humans, and other animals adapted to the Mediterranean environment and changed human civilization in the basin. North Africa was and still is an integral part of the Mediterranean. It was cut off from the rest of Africa by the Saharan Desert. We call the area south of the desert Sub-Saharan Africa, although there was some exchange between the Mediterranean basin and Sub-Saharan Africa. An inhospitable climate and a lack of technology limited travel. Like all deserts, the Sahara has changed size over the tens of thousands of years of its existence. In the ancient world, it was approximately 3.6 million square miles, just slightly smaller than the continental United States. It constituted a more formidable barrier than the mountain ranges to the north and east. The arid desert limited air and water currents as vehicles of exchange between the Mediterranean and the populated sub-Saharan areas of East and West Africa. The Nile flows from East Africa northward through the modern countries of Uganda, South Sudan, Sudan, and Egypt before spilling into the eastern Mediterranean Sea. The river brought a vitally important annual renewal of rich soil along its banks that made ancient Egypt one of the richest and most powerful ancient kingdoms in the Mediterranean. The Nile permitted exchanges of organic and inorganic material between East Africa and the Mediterranean. The sustainable resources of rich soil and fresh water and the valuable trade route north and south constituted two primary reasons why ancient Egyptian civilization was the longest lasting in the ancient Mediterranean world. Historians theorize that sub-Saharan African traders discovered land routes through the western parts of the desert. They jealously guarded their maps so that they could monopolize trade north and south, from oasis to oasis through the desert. Evidence consisting of plants, foodstuff, and human-made objects that originated in West Africa hint at contact between West African and Mediterranean civilizations dating back to ancient times. The exchange between the two areas must have intensified beginning in the 4th century CE. Archaeological excavations in the Mediterranean basin have found ivory from animals indigenous to West Africa that testify to increasing trade between the two areas. Moreover, beginning around the 5th century CE, most of the gold found in the basin can be traced to mines in West Africa. Animals, plants, viruses, and bacteria also traveled with increasing frequency between West Africa and the Mediterranean. Today, scholars have concluded that these exchanges changed both ancient and modern civilizations in Europe, Africa, and Asia in ways that earlier scholars had previously ignored or had assumed only went one way, from a supposedly more civilized Europe to a supposedly less civilized Africa and Asia. These assumptions were only supported by long-held forms of racism and not historical evidence. Given this exchange, and given our topic, I need to make two important observations about the ancient world. First, skin color was not a marker of difference in ancient Weltanschauungs. When I use the term marker of difference, I mean something that social groups use to distinguish one group of people from another. Or to phrase it in social scientific terminology, a marker of difference is a cultural or social construct. Markers of difference are not biological or natural, although people using them often assert that they are. A marker of difference is created by humans for humans whenever one group of people makes the conscious choice of selecting something about another group that they think makes the second group different from the first. Markers of difference can be physiological differences, like a person's sex or height, cultural differences, like a person's religious beliefs or choice of food, social differences, like a person's function in society, economic differences, like wealth or poverty, Political differences like adherence to a political idea or loyalty to a leader, or a combination of one or more. Whenever one creates and uses markers of difference, one engages in othering, a term I introduced in the first podcast. Othering cannot work in a society unless that society teaches its members that markers of difference exist. They are what distinguishes between an us and an other. When we think of education, we naturally think of formal education in schools today, but society has many informal ways of teaching, such as peer pressure, shaming, sarcasm, marketing, advertising, systems of rewards, policing, religious, legal systems, and many others. Markers of difference won't work if people decide they are not appropriate or do not fit. People in the ancient Mediterranean basin noticed, of course, that they differed in skin color and that people from sub-Saharan Africa had different physical features, including those differences in skin color. But they did not use skin color as a marker of difference like we do today. Instead, religion was the most important marker of difference. For people in the ancient Mediterranean world and elsewhere, religion and perceived reality were the same. They explained the existence of all animals, including humans, every inanimate object, and everything humans were capable of imagining through their religious belief systems. Back then, all world views were religious. This observation leads me to a second point. The notions of blackness and whiteness are not universal or biological. In the modern era, skin color became a marker of difference. Europeans created chattel slavery in the 16th century. Chattel slavery is a permanent form of slavery. The offspring of chattel slaves are automatically considered slaves. Groups of European elites found it impossible to impose the system on other Europeans, whereas they found that they could impose chattel slavery on men and women bought on the slave markets of sub-Saharan Africa and taken thousands of miles to Europe and the New World, where they were cut off from their original homes. The way they enforced the system of chattel slavery was to associate darker skin color with negative cultural, social, economic, and political characteristics. European elites taught their societies darker meant biological inferiority. This systemic form of racism made European society very wealthy for the next 100 years, and that same systemic racism exists today in different forms. Religion was the most important marker of difference in Europe up to the 16th century. Thereafter, skin color slowly emerged alongside it. Before there was systemic racism based on skin color, there was systemic racism based on religion. People living in the ancient Mediterranean world had different forms of slavery and just did not consider skin color to be a marker of difference. Today, instead, even when we look at representations of ancient people, we think of them as black or white, but doing so is anachronistic, a word that means historically inaccurate. It would be like claiming that, say, the ancient Romans flew planes or used the internet. That's just impossible. Let's return to our discussion of the ancient Mediterranean basin to consider its western border, the Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic was the most formidable and longest-lasting barrier to the Mediterranean basin and Europe in general. The Atlantic Ocean is huge. It's more than 41 million square miles and borders 5 continents: Europe, Africa, North and South America, and Antarctica. The mouth of the Mediterranean Sea, called the Straits of Gibraltar today, is located between the southwestern tip of Europe and the northwestern tip of Africa. This narrow stretch of water is approximately 9 miles or 14 kilometers wide. Its geographical configuration limited ocean and air currents from the Atlantic from reaching the Mediterranean basin. Thus, organic and inorganic material located along the rest of the Atlantic, in the Americas, and in the areas of Africa below the Saharan Desert were cut off from the Mediterranean, and vice versa, that is, until humans discovered how to navigate the ocean in the 16th century. Now that we have a basic understanding of the environment of the ancient Mediterranean, let's turn to the Hebrews. For about 1,000 years, the tribe went by the name of the Hebrews. Then, around 1020 BCE, they began to call themselves Israelites. The term Israelite derived from the name of an important character in Hebrew mythology named Israel, also known as Jacob. Israel was the grandson of Abraham, a character who, as we shall see, played an even more important role in Hebrew mythology than Jacob. The change in terminology from Hebrew to Israelite coincided with a shift from a nomadic life to permanent communities, when the Israelites conquered an area of land called Canaan that had previously been controlled by the Canaanites. The Israelites conquered the area because they believed that their God had promised it to them as a new homeland after they had supposedly escaped slavery in Egypt. They renamed the conquered area Israel, and thereafter they considered the land to be their promised land because they believed that their God had promised it to them. Even when they were expelled from the land by foreign invaders, the land remained to them as their promised land. The location of the Promised Land today covers territory in the modern countries of Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, Egypt, and the State of Israel. Of course, in antiquity, anyone who did not believe in the Hebrew God refused to accept the notion of a promised land for the Israelites, and many today still do not recognize the validity of Jewish claims to any of this land. Let's return again to the ancient Israelites. Around 500 BCE, after having lived in exile for approximately 4 generations, the Israelites returned to their former homes. It was during this period that the Israelites became known as the Jews. The new designation derived from the name Judah, another important character in Hebrew and Jewish mythology. He was the son of Israel, also called Jacob, and the great-grandchild of Abraham. In this class, we will simplify our use of the 3 terms, Hebrews, Israelites, and Jews. We will say that the Hebrews eventually became the Israelites, and the Israelites eventually became the Jews. Admittedly, this is an oversimplification, but it is one that works in this class because our focus is on anti-Semitism and not ancient history. Now that you understand our usage of the terms Hebrews, Israelites, and Jews, let's turn to my 4th expectation, to understand the connections between the Hebrews and the 3 Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I already pointed out that the tribes calling themselves Hebrews saw themselves as the descendants of the mythical character Abraham. So too did Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Let's first consider the myth of Abraham. It's central to our story. The myth of Abraham is recounted in the book of Genesis in the Bible. I'm going to simplify it. A man named Abram lived about 2000 BCE. His wife's name was Sarah. When Abram was about 90 years old, he came to know a God. The God asked Abram to believe in and obey it, even if Abram could not see the God. When Abram agreed, the God then commanded Abram to leave his home and settle in a new area, where the God assured Abram that he would have children, despite the fact that Abram and his wife Sarah were too old to bear any. The God promised even more. He told Abram that he and Sarah would have so many descendants that they would become too numerous to count. The God also promised to be with Abram and his descendants always. in both victory and defeat. Abram obeyed the God even though he could not see it, and even though it seemed impossible that he and his wife could have a child. He left his home to settle elsewhere. Years passed, and Abram was again visited by the same God, who repeated the earlier promise. Sarah, convinced that she was now barren, had her servant Hagar lie with Abram in her place so that the God's prophecy would come true. When Hagar became pregnant, the relationship between the two women became impossible, so Hagar fled Abram's household. She returned shortly afterward, claiming that an angel had instructed her to do so. The angel told Hagar that she would bear a son whom she should call Ishmael, and so it happened. More years passed, and the God returned to Abram and told him that he would now have another child, this time with his wife Sarah. The God repeated the offer that if Abram and his descendants believed in the God and lived their lives exactly the way the God would demand, Abram would have descendants too numerous to count, and that this God would be with him and his descendants in victory and defeat. The unseen God formalized the relationship as a covenant, or bargain, between itself and Abram and his descendants. As a sign of accepting the covenant as this God's chosen people, the God instructed Abram to change his name to Abraham, which means father of many nations. The God demanded that Abraham circumcise himself and all the male members of his household, including the servants, as a visible sign of the covenant. Abram was also made to promise that from here on out, all male descendants would be circumcised shortly after birth, as a sign of their identity as the chosen people. Abram, now Abraham, did what his God commanded. Sarah soon gave birth to a son, whom Abraham named Isaac. Soon afterwards, Hagar and Sarah began to bicker again, so much so that Sarah demanded that Abram send Hagar and Ishmael away. Abraham sought his God's advice and was instructed to send Hagar and Ishmael on their way. The God informed Abraham and his family that since both Ishmael and Isaac were Abraham's sons, each would be fathers to many nations. Hagar and Ishmael left Abraham's household and settled in Egypt. Eventually, Isaac, the son of Abraham, had a boy named Jacob, whose name the God commanded to change to Israel. First, the Israelites, and later the Jews, claim theological and biological descent from Abraham. Theological descent meant that the heirs of Abraham followed the conditions of the covenant. So long as they followed the God of Abraham's commandments, they remained the chosen people. If they rejected the covenant completely and permanently, they were no longer members of the chosen people, and neither were their offspring. The term biological descent is easy enough to understand. It means that the Israelites and the Jews believe that an unbroken line of descent existed through the maternal line, beginning with Abraham and Sarah, through Isaac and his wife Rebekah, through Jacob and his 2 wives, through Jacob's 12 children and their wives. According to Jewish mythology, these 12 sons became the progenitors of the 12 tribes of Israel. Centuries later, a supposed unbroken biological chain existed from Abraham and Sarah to the survivors of the Holocaust and the founders of the Jewish state of Israel, created in 1948. Now let's consider the Christians. At first, the followers of Jesus claim both theological and biological descent. As we will discuss in greater detail, Jesus, a Jewish leader active in the 1st century CE, preached that the God of Abraham offered a new covenant through him. Anyone who accepted this new covenant would belong to what was called the kingdom of God and become a new chosen people who would replace the original chosen people. At first, the followers of Jesus remained a sect of Judaism, among many other sects in the 1st century CE. Their legitimacy as a new chosen people lay both in their belief in Jesus and his teachings and their claimed descent from Abraham and Sarah, through Isaac and his wife, through Jacob and his 2 wives, through the 12 tribes of Israel, and centuries later through Jesus and his followers. As we will explore in greater detail, later followers of Jesus privileged theological descent over biological descent. According to his later followers, Jesus was both man and God, and had chosen to remain a Jew because his appearance in the 1st century CE supposedly fulfilled Jewish prophecies for the followers of Jesus. So, biological descent remained essential up to and including the birth of Jesus. But after his death and supposed resurrection, only belief in Jesus as God and obedience to the teachings his later followers attributed to him were essential to belonging to the new chosen people. Like Christians, Muslims claim both theological and biological descent from Abraham. But, according to Muslims, the one God chose Ishmael as the firstborn of Abraham to be the true biological heir to the covenant. Ishmael settled in the city of Mecca, in what is now known as Saudi Arabia today. According to Muslims, his offspring were the Arabs. In the 7th century CE, the one true God who had manifested itself to the Israelites and the Jews, according to the Jews, now made itself known to an Arab named Muhammad. The same one true God informed Muhammad that while Jews and Christians were right to worship it as their God, they had gotten things wrong. According to Muslims, the God of Abraham then gave Muhammad the one true and perfect understanding of itself. As Muhammad's religion spread around the Arab world, one no longer had to be an Arab to be a true follower of the one true God. Instead, one only had to accept the one true God as revealed to Muhammad. Theological descent took precedence over biological descent. The branching descent of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam from the ancient Hebrews had a fundamental consequence for understanding why a potential for anti-Semitism was intrinsic to all societies sharing the Abrahamic tradition. Individuals and social groups belonging to the Abrahamic tradition shared a common perception of belonging in one way or another to an ancient Hebrew heritage. For Jews and Jewish communities, a perceived Hebrew heritage passed through them and their beliefs. They were the true heirs of Abraham. For Christians in Christian society, a perceived Hebrew heritage passed through and included Judaism and Jewish history, at the very least, through the lifetime of Jesus and his early followers. They considered themselves the true heirs of Abraham from Jesus' lifetime onwards. For Muslims and Islamic societies, by contrast, a perceived Hebrew heritage bypassed Judaism and passed from Ishmael to the Arabs and Muhammad. They were the true heirs of Abraham, not the Jews or the Christians. Despite these differences, and despite conflicting claims of heritage, all individuals and societies belonging to the Abrahamic tradition base their understandings of themselves, the outside world, and their conception of the logic that supposedly runs the universe on perceived truths about the Jews and Judaism. Or to put it another way, Jews and Jewishness played an essential role in their Weltanschauung, even though individuals and societies from different cultural backgrounds and from different periods of time understood the terms Jew and Jewishness differently from one Abrahamic tradition to the other. Thus, any society belonging to the Abrahamic tradition contained, and still contains, intrinsically the first core element of our definition of antisemitism, a worldview in which the Jews and Jewishness played a fundamental role in human history. Even today, individuals and social groups that claim a history that is based on an Abrahamic tradition are fundamentally different from those that do not. Thus, most North and South American, European, Israeli, and Muslim societies have basic similarities, but diverge widely from Asian and African societies that do not claim an Abrahamic heritage. The branching descent of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam from the ancient Hebrews also raised, and still raises, a pressing question that I want you to know. It will help us to understand the emergence of the first systemic form of antisemitism with the creation of Christianity and the Christianization of the Roman Empire between the 1st and 4th centuries CE. This question is not simply a theological one that mattered to past individuals and societies belonging to the Abrahamic tradition. It remains a fundamental question today, which still imagines reality as putting one group, and not the others, at the center of history and the destiny of humanity as the heirs to the chosen people. Is it the United States with our Judeo-Christian traditions? Is it an imagined Western civilization that also draws on Judeo-Christian traditions? Does history belong to modern forms of Islam that drew from Muslim traditions? Or does it belong to the State of Israel because its leaders lay claim to a Jewish and therefore Hebrew heritage?